Hi everybody. This video provides a little bit of background information on the stories assigned for week 10. I'm going to begin by talking about Araby by James Joyce. Araby was initially published in 1914 as part of a collection of stories called Dubliners. Each of the stories in this collection basically focuses on a specific person living in Dublin during this time period. The story is told from the perspective of a boy who is growing up in a sort of drab and boring part of Dublin, Ireland, and is infatuated with his friend's sister. So I have some questions that I want you to focus on when you are reading the story. And these questions will help you prepare for both the quiz and the discussion this week. So the first question I want you to consider is how the narrator describes the setting. What kind of specific words, images, figures of speech does he use to describe the houses in his neighborhood? And also, what words and images does he use to describe his own house? And then along with that, I want you to think about how the narrator describes the bazaar before he goes to it. And if you don't know what a bazaar is, look it up. And as you're doing this, I want you to think about the sort of difference between the way that he describes his neighborhood and his house, and then the bazaar, and how these sort of, to him, represent two different worlds, and two different sort of kinds of experiences. And then along with that, how does the idea of the bazaar affect him? And what does he expect when he gets to this bazaar? Eventually, the narrator does get to the bazaar, and I want you to pay attention to what he finds when he gets there and how it's different from what he expected. And then again, going back to the kinds of things we've been talking about this whole semester, what words and images and figures of speech does he use to describe the reality of the bazaar? And how does that sort of illustrate, what he's experiencing? And then finally, I want you to really pay attention to the end of the story. This end of the story is often described as a kind of epiphany, so a sort of aha or moment, or a moment when the character realizes something. So in this moment, what does the narrator realize about himself or his life, and how does his general sort of perspective on the world change in this moment? And then the second story I'm going to talk about is A&P by John Updike. So this story is set at a grocery store in the 1950s when it was written, and the narrator, Sammy, is an employee in this grocery store. Despite being set in a very different time and place than Araby, the story actually has a lot in common with that story. In fact, as I say here, the story is often described as a modern retelling of Araby. So there's a lot of sort of thematic similarities that hopefully you will pick up on as you're reading A&P. So questions that I want you to think about as you're reading A&P, a lot of these sort of hinge on how the narrator, Sammy, describes the things he encounters. So first of all, how does he describe the setting, which in this case is the grocery store? What words, images, figures of speech does he use to describe the people who are in the grocery store, most of whom are women? And then along with that, how does he describe these three girls that come in who are wearing bathing suits? How are these characters different from the other customers, and how is his descriptions of them different from the other women who were there in the grocery store? On a specific sort of part of the story, Sammy imagines one of the girls' living rooms. I want you to think about how he describes it. How is this living room that he's imagining different from his own home? And what does this difference tell us about Sammy's background and the kind of world that Sammy inhabits? And then there's another character that pops up who's named Lengle. So I want you to pay attention to how Sammy describes Lengle. And based on that, think about what kinds of values or sort of approaches to life that Lengle represents. And then, again, at the end of this story, there is also this sort of epiphany moment. And so I want you to pay attention to that moment and think about sort of what Sammy realizes about himself or about his own life or about even his world in this moment at the end of the story. How does his perspective on the world change in this moment? So those are the questions I have for you. In addition to reading Araby and AMP, I'm also asking you to read a sort of comic book adaptation of Araby, and I also have some questions for you to consider about that, but I'm going to save those for the directions on the discussion board. A lot of those questions just have to do with how the characters in AMP, the characters and the themes in Araby are being portrayed in that comic book. So I hope you enjoyed the stories, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about them.